And now I'm going to admit everyone. We have 26 people.
Great.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Wait for them to show up.
You can see the whole screen, right?
You can see the whole screen,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, everyone, as they're all joining. We've got 2 more people that are still logging in now.
Okay.
Perfect.
2 more. Okay. Alyssa, why don't you take it away?
Okay, I'm gonna start now.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of DOCOMOMO Hawaii, I want to welcome you to our very first virtual talk story event. Usually we host these talk stories in person, but for obvious reasons, we are doing this virtually for our first time and quite excited for this special talk. I see quite a lot of familiar faces and names in attendance with us, so thank you all for joining us. For those who don't already know me, I am Alyssa Carson, the current president of the DOCOMOMO Hawaii chapter. DOCOMOMO is an international and national organization which stands for the documentation, conservation of the modern movement. And our Hawaii chapter, we aim to promote public awareness and education about Hawaii's mid-century era. Prior to COVID, we normally host about 1 physical event a month where we often get together, have a drink, and learn about buildings, art pieces, people, and all other kinds of fun things that have contributed to Hawaii's mid-century period. So hopefully one day we can get back together and restart our events. In the meantime, we are trying to figure out how best to host more of these virtual type events, so definitely stay tuned. We have a couple updates before we get on with the show. If you haven't already received our February newsletter, there are 2 Hawaii mid-century related events hosted by other organizations that are happening. We are excited to promote the online exhibit called Alfred Priest's Vienna in the Tropics, which just debuted about a week ago. Laura McGuire, a DOCOMOMO Hawaii board member and professor at the University of Hawaii School of Architecture, helped co-author this exhibit. So I'll place a link in the chat if you want to check it out. It's a very well put together exhibition about Priest's life. So check it out if you haven't already done so. And secondly, on March 11th, there will be a webinar to learn about the Ossipoff and Snyder Architects Collection at UH Manoa's Hamilton Library. I will also post a link in the chat if you're interested in signing up for this webinar. It should be pretty informative and an interesting one, as they're very fortunate to have a vast and extensive collection, which I believe was donated by Sid Snyder himself. Anyway, that's all I have. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Graham so he can do the honors in introducing tonight's special guest. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. This is awesome. We've got 33 people on the call right now, and had no idea how many people we're going to get. So this is a good turnout. The format for tonight is that our guest is going to give about a 45-minute to an hour presentation. And then afterwards, I'll let you guys unmute yourselves and we'll have a Q&A session. If you hear a squeak in the background, it's my dog. I'm sorry. But yeah, without further ado, our guest tonight is Dr. Ladislav Jackson. He's an art and architectural historian and a faculty member and a vice dean at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Brno University of Technology. He teaches courses on the 20th century art, architecture, and design history. In his research, he focuses on East Central European architectural modernism. Since 2016, he has researched the life and work of J.J. Polifka in global perspective. In the last 8 years, he authored, edited, or co-edited over 20 books on architecture and design history. Between 2016 and 2017, he was a Fulbright visiting researcher at UC Berkeley, and he also specializes in feminist and queer history of visual culture. So he'll be talking about constructing global modernism, as you guys can see on the screen here, about J.J. Polifka, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Henry Kaiser. So without further ado, Jaroslav, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for having me. It's a really special occasion for me that I'm able and allowed to speak here in Hawaii for DOCOMOMO Hawaii. And I have plenty of pictures, I have plenty of information to share with you. I have some new discoveries. So let's get straight to it. So first, I would like to thank DOCOMOMO Hawaii and especially Graham Hart to make this talk happen. And I would like to thank for having me again. I'm no expert in Hawaiian architectural history, obviously. I'm only visiting for the second time now, so I have to disappoint you at the beginning. I'm not going to analyze any particular Hawaiian architectural gem. However, as I would like to suggest in the following talk, Hawaii and Henry Kaiser's development here was a key piece of the puzzle that I would like to share with you tonight. The talk will take about 40-45 minutes, and then we will have some time for Q&A. I would love to hear your comments and answer your questions if my limited knowledge will allow me to. Today, February the 9th, is actually very significant, and I only realized that after we set up the date. It is the 61st anniversary of Jaroslav J. Polifka's passing, whom I will be talking about most of the time. I would like to mark this occasion, and also I would like to welcome here Jaroslav Polifka's grandchildren, who were very welcoming, kind, and generous, and allowed me to do my research on their grandfather's life and work. In 1934, Viennese art historians Ernst Kriss and Otto Kurz wrote a very fresh and accessible book, Legend, Myth, and Magic in the Image of an Artist, a historical experiment. Originally, it was titled just Die Legende vom Künstler. Ernst Kriss was both art historian and psychoanalyst, one of the pupils of Sigmund Freud. So they had the best predispositions to come up with a text on a verge between art history and psychoanalysis. Using examples from art history, they discovered repeating patterns in artists' biographies, such as an emphasis on the moment of the reveal of their talent, structuring the biography into a metaphoric arch from early works, higher works, and later works. They also emphasized how the biographies are constructed as original, talented, innovative, yet underappreciated and eccentric geniuses against the society that doesn't understand their creations. Mercilessly, they showed that all these narratives are myths, legends, projective stereotypes, and what we would call them today, constructs. It has been almost 90 years since their book came out. Later, Kriss's and Kurz's thinking has been updated and developed in 1965 by Rudolf and Margot Wittkovers in their book Künstler außerhalb der Gesellschaft. And Kriss's and Kurz's book has been translated into English in 1981 and came out with no other than Ernst Gombrich's preface. And yet, over and over, we tend to shape our narratives of architects' biographies the way which Kriss and Kurz criticized so long ago. Sure, we don't have to use all the stereotypes at once, but we can find one or two in a lot of recent biographies, at least more than we should. There are many ways out of this. Post-structural thinking, the death of the author has been invented more than 50 years ago. There's always critical theory. We can keep asking what, and most importantly, who has been left out of the stories that we construct and reproduce. There's feminist and queer theory, post-colonialism, those are all more than relevant approaches. Today, I would like to do something different, one may say less challenging. I would like to show that no architectural creativity happened by itself and by a single person's will, but was enabled and perpetuated by the social and political metrics surrounding the person. First, let me tell you very briefly the backstory of Jaroslav J. Polifka before he came to the United States. Jaroslav J. Polifka was born in 1884 in Prague. He studied construction engineering at the Technical University in Prague. He shortly practiced in a building company and then, with his wife, left for Zurich, Switzerland. He attended postgraduate studies at the Technical University in Zurich and worked as a head engineer in several companies there. Meantime, the World War I began and he decided to stay in Switzerland. Then he shortly served in the army in the first line. His war diaries have been preserved and are very interesting to read. After the war, in 1918, he returned to Prague. Because he made good money in Zurich during the war, he was able to purchase several building sites in a prominent residential district, Bubenec, in Prague. He designed and built a couple of family houses, which he sold. In 1927, he hired Josef Havlíček, a very promising, progressive, and avant-garde architect who started to design buildings for him and create opportunities for Polifka to show off his innovative engineering skills. Thus, Habig Palace, Chicago Palace, and other modern palaces in Prague, or an unbuilt project for residential towers that held a bridge on top of them were designed. These are the residential towers with the bridge on top of them. He worked with other avant-garde architects such as Oldřich Tyll. In 1928, Polifka also started to work in Brno, the Czech Republic's second largest city, where he built modern city multifunctional palaces and apartment buildings. After 1931, his business was greatly affected by the Great Depression. He had to sell his villa in Bubenec and had to get employed by Thermolux company, which produced glass and he worked there as a sales manager. At the time, he also wrote a couple of theoretical works, some of them on using Thermolux glass in modern architecture. This experience became very significant in his later work. In 1935, Polifka already had this private engineering business again. He designed one of his largest structures, Corn Exchange Building in Rotterdam, with a large span ferroconcrete arches filled with custom-made glass fittings produced by no other than the Thermolux company. Polifka apparently remained grateful to them for hiring him during the crisis for the rest of his life. I will mention it again later. This Rotterdam project became significant later in his dispute with architect Aaron Green in San Francisco Bay Area in 1950s. I will also mention this a little bit later. In 1937, Polifka was hired as an engineer for a Czechoslovak pavilion at the World Fair in Paris. The pavilion was designed by Jaromír Krejcar, the architect, and other designers such as Ladislav Sutnar, Zdeněk Kejř, and Bohumil Soumar. Although Jaroslav Polifka previously wrote a study arguing that the combination of steel and glass is not very suitable because both of these materials have bad characteristics of extensibility, the pavilion is made of steel skeleton and glass hanging facade. The pavilion itself, as well as Polifka's project for a ferroconcrete bridge in Podolsko, the project is from 1937, but it was built between 1940 to 1941 during Polifka's absence. And both of these projects were awarded at the World Fair as an exceptional engineering works. 1 year later, when the Ministry of Public Affairs was deciding who is going to work on a Czechoslovak pavilion at another World Fair, which was planned for the New York City for the years 1939 to 1940, they opened an architectural competition for the design. However, they did not have to compete the engineering work. Architect Kamil Roškot's design was selected in the competition. The pavilion was eventually designed by a different architect than the 1937 Parisian pavilion. But the structural engineer remained the same, Jaroslav Polifka. Jaroslav Polifka left for the New York City with his son, also a structural engineer, the architect, the exhibition designers, such as Ladislav Sutnar again, and other diplomats and officers. While the pavilion construction was in progress, Czechoslovakia was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the German officials tried to stop the pavilion from opening. The designers and diplomats opened the pavilion unfinished as a form of protest. However, Jaroslav Polifka had other problems by the time. His wife came from a Jewish family, so they had to escape Czechoslovakia. He came back to Czechoslovakia for his family. His daughter moved to Slovakia, which became an independent state, independent country. And the last one leaving Czechoslovakia was his wife. His wife's family died in the concentration camps. They met in San Francisco, where shortly Jaroslav Polifka opened his engineering office, which found its first seat in a famous Hogarth building on Market Street in San Francisco. Later, in 1943, he rebuilt a house in North Berkeley, where he also moved his office. Polifka was offered a research job in the Department of Engineering at UC Berkeley, where he started to work on his research on photoelastic analysis of concrete materials. This job was first unpaid. However, thanks to his collaborator, Professor Howard D. Eberhard, he was hired for a full-time tenured position in 1940. Later, between 1952 to 1956, Polifka was a professor at the Stanford University. He had to resign due to his advanced age and progressing illness, but he was begged to stay both by his colleagues and his students for being a great and a popular teacher. But let's go back to the World War II. Only several months after Jaroslav Polifka, or J.J. Polifka, as how he started to call himself, came to the United States. Although his position at UC Berkeley was uncertain by the time, and he was just starting a new engineering business in his mid-50s, in a complicated war conditions, he offered his services to the military. Although he is referred to as being apolitical, he definitely knew what was the right thing to do during the wartime. Polifka's work for Henry Kaiser's industry, Henry Kaiser's shipyards, during the World War II is confirmed yet quite unclear. Here's Jaroslav Polifka in his office at UC Berkeley, and Jaroslav Polifka during his exhibition in 1956 at the Stanford Art Gallery. So here we go with the Richmond Kaiser shipyards. He is listed among the employees in Kaiser shipyards in Richmond. He mentions his work for Kaiser Industries in his bio, and there are some photographs of the Richmond docks and warehouses in his papers, but I was not able to confirm what exactly he actually worked on during his times working for Kaiser shipyards. Kaiser Industries, Kaiser shipyards in Richmond revolutionized building ships during the wartime. They were assembled from prefabricated parts in the docks, which made the ship construction way faster. During the war, Richmond became a very vital city whose population tripled, and many residential districts and infrastructure, such as schools and hospitals, were built for the workers and their families, of course. By that time, Kaiser Industries developed the health insurance Kaiser Permanente and started to develop a system of hospitals. These hospitals were an experimental program in quick construction of the hospitals made from prefabricated metal parts was launched, and I believe that that was exactly what Polifka was a part of, but yet I can't actually confirm that. There was a design for a round shape hospital, which could be constructed in a week from aluminum parts. After the war, Polifka continued in a research on round shape metal constructions for various purposes, as I will show later. Although Kaiser shipyards did not construct any concrete ships, it became a thing during a steel shortage in US military between 1942 to 1943. Jaroslav Polifka became a great admirer of concrete ships. He published an article about concrete ships and trains in 1920 in a Czech magazine that he was an editor of, called the Technical Tribune, Technická tribuna. He wrote that the fields of building ships and construction buildings are getting very close and will become one in the modern era. In that regard, his work for Kaiser shipyards must have been very inspiring and fulfilling for Polifka, given the war circumstances. If we were forced to say what had a bigger influence on Polifka's post-war projects, I mean solitary projects, if it was Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, or Henry Kaiser and the way how his development projects were constructed, we would probably say it was Kaiser Industries. Building from prefabricated parts, steel, aluminum, and ferroconcrete were Polifka's domain. It didn't matter if he worked on a residential building, church, or a warehouse. He preferred to build quick and from standardized parts. The only Wright's influence on Polifka's separate solitary design can be traced very vaguely. Let's say it can be a corner fireplace and ground walls from flat stones on a house for his son Miloš, which was designed in Berkeley. In mid-February 1946, Jaroslav Polifka wrote a letter to Frank Lloyd Wright. In a very polite way, he expressed his disagreement with Wright, who previously wrote for Architectural Records. His letter goes, I'm writing as an old admirer. I'm admiring you as an engineer, although according to your quotation, these engineers are complete damn fools. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright said for Architectural Records. Engineers are guided by the eternal laws of the nature. Take, for example, web of a spider, which definitely should be studied by an engineer whose specialty is to build a suspension bridges, end of quotation. Wright was probably impressed by engineers' way of thinking and maybe also by the fact that he actually didn't want anything of him. So he simply answered, quote, why don't you come over here to see us, end quote. And by here, he meant Taliesin West. Polifka came to see Wright at the beginning of April the same year, and a 13 years lasting cooperation began. They immediately started to discuss at least 3 projects: SC Johnson Headquarters Tower in Wisconsin, Roger Lacey Hotel in Dallas, and the Guggenheim Museum. The Roger Lacey Hotel in Dallas was a tower with rhombus-shaped glass panels. You can see Polifka's design for the rhombus-shaped glass panels on one of the letters. They were supposed to be manufactured by none else than the Thermolux company. However, the main event of the meeting was the Guggenheim Museum ramp. Wright and his co-workers were not able to figure out the structural design of the spiral ramp without any internal support. Polifka, as the documents and the correspondence say, started to work on that immediately after he returned to the Bay Area with his son Miloš. He came up with new calculations and a glass model, which was supposed to show that there is no need for internal support columns. Before he met Wright, Jaroslav Polifka came across another opportunity. There were plans to build 2 crossings across the bay. Polifka came up with his own design. Sorry, here are the Polifka calculations for the Guggenheim Museums. They are quite very extensive. Polifka came up with his own design. The idea was to multiply his former design for the Podolsko Bridge in Czechoslovakia and to add a hanging monorail tram, which he found in a German magazine. You can see that picture below. However, he shared this idea with Wright, and they started to work on a joint and completely different design. Wright's and Polifka's joint project, whose first design is dated by June 1946, looked absolutely different. They presented the project in 1949 to the San Francisco Committee and to the public. According to their text, the bridge was supposed to be both cheap. The motto was 2 bridges for a price of 1, and beautiful. The early Wright and Polifka's designs for one of the bridges incorporated a huge central cylinder that would spin when the ship would want to go through. And this central cylinder was supposed to be made from aluminium. So as you can see, aluminium was sort of the very significant material. However, although they tried to pursue this project for almost a decade, the decision that there will be built a tunnel under the bay sort of ended these designs and these prospects to build two crossings across the bay. Polifka usually visited Wright and his studio at Taliesin West, although he visited Taliesin East at least once over the 13 years. During his visits there, he met other Wright's cooperators and pupils. He became very close to Jean Messeling, Wright's closest cooperator and assistant. Jean Messeling accompanied them on all their trips together, and it was Jean Messeling who arranged Polifka's stays in Taliesin and administered their joint projects. From the correspondence, we can also feel that Jean Messeling tried to diplomatically de-escalate any tensions and disagreements that occurred between Wright and Polifka over the years. And there were quite a few. In Taliesin West, Polifka met with several other Wright's pupils. Here we can see Jaroslav Polifka, probably on his last visit to Taliesin West in 1957, and other Frank Lloyd Wright's pupils and colleagues. Between 1946 to 1948, he met with a group of young men, Glenn O'Hare, Chester J. Wisniewski, and William Patrick. William Patrick just got married and decided to build a house in a beautiful natural settings in Redwood City's hills in South Bay area. He teamed up with his colleagues from Wright's studio and almost 2 generations older Polifka. The young architects had in mind a house in an Usonian style, emerging from the hill, open living space, and cabin-like bedrooms. Polifka came up with one more idea. Why don't they revive Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of textile block systems and use it on the house? Jaroslav J. Polifka designed a variation of concrete blocks that could have been filled with any material, glass, wood, or concrete. Polifka befriended another architect in Wright's studio, architect John Howe. They met in spring 1949 during Polifka's visit at Taliesin West. Howe informed Polifka that they were working on garage, what they were working on in Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. It was the garage ramp for the Falling Water Kaufmann's house, and he was doing also some unspecified revisions on the Guggenheim Museum. Howe expressed his interest in the Butterfly Bay Bridge project. However, he probably did not work on it himself. Polifka also exchanged several letters with William Wesley Peters, who was the main designer at the Guggenheim Museum in Wright's studio. However, the relationship between Wright and Polifka was not always ideal. I would like to share Wright's letter from March the 15th, 1952, which reveals several tensions in their cooperation. One of them concerns the project for a cliff house on Sea Cliff in San Francisco for Frank Lloyd Wright's client V.C. Morris. According to Wright, Polifka wanted to do some calculations on the construction, and that's why Wright lended the plans to Polifka. That might have seemed like the first contact between Polifka and Morris. However, there is another letter suggesting that Polifka was working on Morris's shop in San Francisco 3 years earlier in 1949. If he was doing some structural designs or some calculations for the ramp in V.C. Morris's shop, sorry, here is the cliff house at the Sea Cliff in San Francisco. That's Frank Lloyd Wright's design. On the right side, you can see Jaroslav Polifka's calculations. And here you can see V.C. Morris' shop in San Francisco. So if he was working on that ramp that was later elaborated into the ramp in the Guggenheim Museum is unclear. And there is another letter from VC Morris to Polifka from 1951, suggesting that they were friends and they were exchanging materials and notes on cooperation and contacts on Frank Lloyd Wright, such as Frank Lloyd Wright hasn't written me for some time, and etc. Polifka's involvement in Frank Lloyd Wright's project in San Francisco Bay Area was probably not very appreciated by Aaron Green, Frank Lloyd Wright's cooperator in the Bay Area and head of his San Francisco office. As suggested many times in the correspondence, mostly regarding the Butterfly Bay Bridge, Green and Polifka were in a lively touch. Apparently, Polifka trusted Green and considered him a friend and colleague. Green, however, did not feel the same way about Polifka. In the letter from March 15, 1951, which I already showed you before, Wright was not happy about Polifka's telling Green that he owes him money, which was always an issue with Frank Lloyd Wright. Apparently, Polifka confided this information to Green, and Green told on Polifka to Frank Lloyd Wright. As the architectural historian Paul Turner, Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, writes in his book on Frank Lloyd Wright's work in San Francisco Bay Area, which came out in 2016, Green also started a rumor about Polifka, and the rumor said that one of his structures in Europe has collapsed. Actually, this was true. He meant the Corn Exchange building in Rotterdam. However, he left out the part that this building has collapsed during the World War II, during bombing at the end of the war. So it was not fault of Polifka's poor engineering work, as Aaron Green has suggested. Apparently, Polifka never learned about Green's gossip, because right after Frank Lloyd Wright passed away in 1959, he wrote him a lovely letter about Wright's passing, how he mentions him in his last book, and asking Aaron Green if he could employ his son Jan in their New York project of Belmont Sports Pavilion, because Jan Polifka got an engineering license in the New York State by the time. In 1953, when the plans for the Belmont Sports Pavilion moved forward, Wright was looking for a contractor who would be able to realize their daring design. Polifka suggested his colleague, Roger Corbetta. Followingly, Roger Corbetta visited Taliesin West with his wife, and the cooperation began. In Taliesin West, Polifka also met a world-famous architect, Bruno Zevi. Zevi wrote a lovely poem about Taliesin West, where he admires the beauties of the property, which they both considered a magic place. Polifka called it heaven on earth, and one of the stays they stayed in Taliesin West together. They stayed in touch. Polifka wrote to Zevi details about the Belmont Sports Pavilion project, but the purpose, whether Zevi was supposed to be involved in the project, is unclear. However, we can think that he was supposed to be at some extent involved in the project, because the details and the structural engineering and how the project was supposed to move forward was quite very extensive in the correspondence. Between 1948 to 1959, Polifka was in touch with a Spanish structural engineer, Eduardo Toroja, who specialized in ferroconcrete shell constructions. Polifka wanted to publish his book, Philosophy of Structures, which was eventually published by the UC Berkeley in his and his son's translation. You can see the book Philosophy of Structures on the right side. During this process, Polifka mentioned Toroja's work to Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to meet him, which Polifka promptly arranged. Toroja came to San Francisco with his two employees and accompanied by Polifka and also San Francisco-based architectural critic Elizabeth Kendall Thompson. They visited the VC Morris shop, as you can see on the photograph. Then they continued to Taliesin West, where they joined Wright and spent there a couple of days. They went to an excursion to Arizona-Baltimore Hotel, which Frank Lloyd Wright designed between 1929 to 1930. They were still accompanied by Toroja's two colleagues, and also Gene Messeling and probably William Wesley Peters, because he appears on some photographs from this trip. A very fruitful cooperation began. The trio, Wright, Polifka, and Torouha, worked on the utopian project of a mile-high building in Illinois and the Belmont Sports Pavilion in New York that I have mentioned earlier. This is the mile-high building, which was supposed to accumulate all the city function in one tall skyscraper, like residential, work, infrastructure, schools, shopping, of course, parking, garages, etc. Actually, Eduardo Torouha and Jaroslav Polifka did the structural designs, and they calculated that this project would be sometimes in the future possible using new modern structural materials and structural construction designs. Torouha's book, Philosophy of Structures, was first published in English with Jaroslav and Miloš Polifka's translation. Later, it was published in Spanish. It was illustrated with several Polifka's Bay Area projects, and it was published only a couple of months before Jaroslav J. Polifka's passing. And how do we connect all this together and how it is related to Hawaii? In 1955, Frank Lloyd Wright was asked by Henry Kaiser. There are a couple of letters in Frank Lloyd Wright's collections in the Avery Library at the Columbia University in New York. He was asked by Henry Kaiser through his Kaiser Aluminum Corporation. Henry Kaiser moved to Hawaii in 1954 to sort of retire, but he started many development projects here. So he asked him to consult a project of an aluminum geodesic dome. As I have mentioned, the experiments with aluminium as a construction material and the dome as a new layout experiment for hospitals had been developed by Kaiser for quite some time, since the World War II. The design for the aluminum hospital dome was designed by San Francisco-based architect Clarence Mayhew and was consulted by a medical doctor, Sidney Garfield, who was also a consulting medical doctor for the whole Kaiser Permanente project and also the whole development structure. The idea of a geodesic dome was perpetuated by Richard Buckminster Fuller, and one of them was built as part of Henry Kaiser's Hilton Waikiki Resort in Honolulu, actually a couple of feet from where I'm actually sitting at. As you can see, the Kaiser Aluminum Dome. Here you can see Richard Buckminster Fuller, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Henry Kaiser consulting the geodesic dome for the Waikiki Resort here in Honolulu. And between 1952 to 1956, Polifka and Fuller were very close colleagues at Stanford University, working on a research. Here's another plan and view of the Hilton Waikiki Resort. And between 1952 to 1956, Polifka and Fuller were very close colleagues at Stanford University, working on a research on metal prefabricated construction parts that could span long distance and that would be designed in a round shape. Also, there is only one letter between Jaroslav Polifka and Richard Buckminster Fuller. Jaroslav Polifka's last project, because he was very active in publishing and he published a lot of papers, and he also wanted to publish a lot of his projects, both together with Frank Lloyd Wright and also his separate projects. And his last publication project was supposed to be the encyclopedia of world famous structural engineers. Of course, he wanted to include himself, but he also wanted to include a lot of European, Asian, and Northern American structural engineers, such as Richard Buckminster Fuller. And the only letter that has been preserved is the letter where Richard Buckminster Fuller titles Jaroslav Polifka with a very familiar name Jaro, which was only reserved for very close friends, and he agrees in his involvement in this project, in the publication project. In his 1997 paper, Creativity as Commonplace, published in the Design Studies Journal, architectural and computer studies theorist Richard Coyne writes the following, quote, "The modern conception of creativity is of a human faculty that exceeds the everyday and routine processes of thinking and doing. By this understanding, artists are highly creative. So too are architects at their best, clever scientists, engineers, managers, entrepreneurs, and educators, when their judgments produce interesting or unexpected outcomes." He continues, the presupposition is that creativity or any cognitive function is regarded as a phenomenon pertaining to the individual. Here, the romantic legacy of the genius comes to the fore. Prior to the concept of the individual creative genius is the concept of beings totally engaged in a world without differentiation. As I tried to suggest in this talk, engaging a very incoherent group of architects, designers, engineers, journalists, clients, and contractors, the modern creativity, even revolving around such a great mind as Frank Lloyd Wright was always a mutual exchange of ideas and designs within a social matrix that has never been modeled as a hierarchy, but rather as a horizontal network. Sure, there were differences, different agencies, there were different interests and different capabilities, but the gain was in cooperation, even though there had been some disagreements on the way. And I think that this is a way more understandable and relatable way of thinking about modern architectural creativity than an authoritarian genius as we are used to think about major figures such as Frank Lloyd Wright, and as much as they wanted us to think that way. Thank you very much for your attendance, for your attention, and I would like to hear your comments or questions or whatever you have to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing everything. Let me turn allow participants to unmute themselves. So if there's any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask, or put it in the chat. I'll try to moderate both. Absolutely fantastic projects. Those projects all around the U.S. They were just, I mean, fantastic, utopian, imaginative, dynamic projects. I wish we still had the geodesic dome here in Hawaii. That would have been something to see, but really just, I mean, incredible work. Does anyone have any questions for Ladislav?
Please shoot, and comments and whatever.
Anyone? Don't be shy. Should be able to unmute yourself. If not, put it in the chat.
Or you can write it in the chat.
I do have a question.
Sure.
Yes.
Hello.
My question is, Wright is so often seen as this very solitary, your interpretation is much more realistic perhaps and pluralistic, and do you consider some of that to be on his own self-absorption and arrogance, that he didn't share his collaboration with others as much as he might have?
Right. However, Jaroslav Polifka was mentioned in a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright's projects. He's also mentioned as a co-author of a couple of projects. There was in the letter that I presented from March the 15th, 1952. There's also a very interesting sentence where they had sort of a disagreement of what are their roles, because it was Jaroslav Polifka who came up with this project of the San Francisco Bay crossing, and he came to Frank Lloyd Wright. But then Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, couldn't handle the idea that he would be the architect for the main engineer. So there is this very interesting sentence that he clearly states to Polifka that you are my consulting engineer, I am not your consulting architect. So Frank Lloyd Wright was, of course, very careful about how he is perceived, and that he's always perceived as the main figure, and that the myth that he tried to, and the image that he tries to construct around himself, and that he also used the media to reproduce about himself is always the right one, and that always he is in the control of this image and of this myth. However, he probably knew that he wouldn't be able to do all these exceptional projects and to create all these exceptional projects and works without people helping him. So in this regard, the collaborators and colleagues that he hired as consulting engineers and consulting architects, such as Eduardo Torouha or Jaroslav Polifka and others, had actually a little bit better position in the whole structure, because they were mentioned and they were acknowledged, unlike Frank Lloyd Wright's employees and Frank Lloyd Wright's pupils, who are not even mentioned in the project, and who we only can guess who did what, and is sort of a subject of a very extensive scholar research nowadays, who was actually working on project, etc. in Frank Lloyd Wright studios. So in this regard, Jaroslav Polifka was sort of exceptional because he was an outsider. However, this is also, in my opinion, this is also a reason why he was sort of forgotten for almost 40 years. New interest in his work and new interest in his life and in his cooperation with Frank Lloyd Wright emerged around 2000, thanks to a scholar, Barry Muscat in Buffalo, who put together an exhibition and put together a catalog accompanying this exhibition about the cooperation between Frank Lloyd Wright and Jaroslav Polifka, because we know who was the part of Frank Lloyd Wright's group. We know who were his apprentices. We know who was part of the fellowship. We know who were his employees, and of course they were sort of trying to live on this legend and live on this experience with Frank Lloyd Wright. And as they were trying to reproduce and perpetuate this Frank Lloyd Wright's myth, this brand, they excluded all these external or these consulting people who worked on Frank Lloyd Wright's projects. So this actually still lives among the few Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices in Taliesin West and in Taliesin East. When I came there and tried to ask about their experience with Jaroslav Polifka's visits and if they remember him and how they remember him, they actually denied that he has ever been there and that he ever worked on these projects. So this sort of still lives on, and that's sort of the reason why he is, on one hand, he is mentioned in some of these projects, and on the other hand, he is sort of excluded from the Frank Lloyd Wright's myth and the myth of the fellowship.
That's incredible. On that same question about these big egos and figureheads that you usually hear about, like Frank Lloyd Wright or Henry Kaiser, or in kind of Hawaii's case, Buckminster Fuller. I think everyone refers to the dome as Fuller's geodesic dome that he did here in Waikiki. Can you tell us any more insight about that relationship between Fuller, architect, engineer, inventor, everything that he did, and JJ, and how that relationship was? I mean, because I think in Hawaii people don't remember his name either.
Right. So Richard Buckminster Fuller was a professor of engineering at Stanford University. He was one of the professors who invited and who sort of fought for Jaroslav Polifka to become a professor at Stanford, because he was already in the age of retirement, and he was a professor, full-time professor at UC Berkeley. So they asked him to come there, and they wanted him to be there, and he actually taught there for 4 years. And the Department of Engineering at Stanford University was quite not very extensive, but Richard Buckminster Fuller was probably the most famous figure there. So from this one letter that I have access to, and I didn't have a chance to go through the extensive Richard Buckminster Fuller's collection, which is stored at Stanford University due to the COVID restrictions. However, I have the inventory, so there are not any, or according to the inventory, there are no Jaroslav Polifka's letters to Buckminster Fuller. So we have only this one letter where he titles Jaroslav Polifka Jaro, which is really a very familiar name, and they were on a very familiar basis. And this letter is about the project of the encyclopedia of the world's greatest structural engineers that I mentioned before. But from this, we can assume that they were really close colleagues, and there was this research that they were both working on, which were the round-shaped metal construction parts for different usage. It didn't really have any specific usage. It was for sports pavilions, for hospitals, for schools, etc. So that was something that they were both working on at Stanford. So that's actually everything I can tell about the relationship without making stuff up. But apparently they were very close, and they were both connected by Henry Kaiser and their work in different stages of their life for Henry Kaiser and Henry Kaiser's Industries and Kaiser Permanente, and the ideas of prefabricated manufactured parts, either ferroconcrete or metal or aluminium, which they were both apparently fans of as a new structural material. So that was all connected. That's what I was trying to show you, that it was all connected, and everyone knew everyone.
That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, just all the names that have been dropped tonight in your presentation, and all the projects. I mean, things that everyone knows the world around. Are there any other questions, either in the chat, or feel free to turn on your mic?
If not, I think, well, Tonya mentioned that she noticed some of maybe JJ's relatives are on our presentation. Would we be able to acknowledge them?
I can't really see all the participants, but I've mentioned Vera Benesh. I saw Vera Benesh and Jan Benesh before.
Wow. Are these the?
So those are Vera Benesh is Jaroslav Polifka's granddaughter. There's Kay Polifka Starkweather, another Jaroslav Polifka's granddaughter. I hope you don't mind me pointing you out, but I already greeted you and thank you at the beginning. So yeah, so thank you very much for being here, for making time. It's I guess kind of late in the Bay Area. It's I think 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock p.m. So late night presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's quite a treat. And Ladislav, thank you so much for this great presentation. It was very informative, and so much information that I guess you uncovered, and we're so thankful for you to share that all with us.
I am trying to, and the research is still going on, so hopefully I will connect it a little better in the future. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the great hospitality in Hawaii. And hopefully I will see some of you, if not all of you, someday in the future, face to face.
Yes, next time you're in Hawaii, hopefully we can all do this in person.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Well, this presentation's been recorded, so we'll hopefully be able to share a link in the near future in case anyone wants to share it with colleagues or go back and look at some of those awesome projects and photos. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.